Hi there, Kris here with another installment in our Highlight Everything series. In this video we're going to be looking at Zenithal highlighting. And so to serve as our example, we're going to be using a Zenithal model from the Dark Potential game system. And as you can see, the model has been already base coated up with sapphire blue on the armor plates and a little bit of gray and for the gun and the flesh, which were just washed in a purple and a black. And so as you can see, we're going to be starting off with the shadows. And so you're thinking, well, Kris, this was highlight everything. What are you doing? Well, you can't start with the highlighting process until you've created your shadows and such. And the shadows, when dealing with this particular kind of highlighting, become very important, as really you want to create, a good amount of contrast, just so that the effect of your highlighting will work. And so for this, we're dealing with Zenithal highlighting, which is an imagined light source directly above. Now, often it's described as directly above, but it could also come directly from the side or from underneath. And so really it is just that the light source is to one particular point. So there's only like one illumination source, and really that's it with this particular highlighting. And so as you can see here, I'm using rust brown to create the shadows, which is really it's really an orange. It's got a bit of a brown to it, but it's also almost the same value as the blue, which is going to create more of a gray tone. It will take the blue down a bit, and we're going to allow that orangey brown to remain in the crevices too, just for giggles. And so you can see here, we're not going to concentrate too much on the highest points, because we're going to imagine our light source is directly above us. And so as you can see, we're just going to continue to work the shadows, concentrating on the underside of objects. And so as I stated before, creating your shadows really is the main focus when you're doing this particular kind of highlighting. And now one would say, well, Kris, we can just simply use an airbrush and achieve the effect a lot more quickly. And yes, you'd most likely be right, but some of us don't want to use an airbrush, some of us don't have access to it, and so we're simply just going to brush this in. And besides, this is a lot more fun, isn't it? And so as you can see here, we're just putting the colors in, and I was talking over the part where it was showing that I'm using an acrylic retarder in a one-to-one fashion as well. So we just quickly work our way. Now, when we were working on the underside of details, we're not going to be hitting any of those areas, particularly like underneath the chest there, with any of the highlights. And so we're going to allow most of that shadow color to remain there. Now, the orange isn't particularly a dark color, but we're using the complementary color because, well, it's going to look a lot more interesting if we just, instead of just using simply a darker blue or a black. And again, it just looks visually interesting. And besides, we're going for something kind of different. Often when we are working with models that we're too familiar with, it's kind of fun to experiment with color schemes and such and different techniques. And so this guy's one of those rare opportunities we get to experiment with color, and why not? Because it's not particularly well established how this guy is supposed to be painted. And so we can really have a lot of fun. There's really a lot of artistic license afforded with models like this, where it's really just kind of up to your imagination as to how and where color will be applied. So as you can see, we just continue to work in the shadows. And you can see that on the brush, it looks like a pretty heavy load on the bristles, but it's not. It's just the way the retarder works with the color and kind of thickens it up. But as I've mentioned before, when you're using the retarder, it doesn't stay very thick. In fact, it reduces, when it dries, it reduces down and becomes quite flat and even. It's really nice. It's a great way to get your color blending going, just for anybody who's interested in color blending. And so you can see we lay down quite a bit of the rust brown on the underside here, and then we start to blend the color back in. And as we blend it in, the color, the blue, does change and it becomes quite darker, and it's actually going more towards the gray point of the color scale. And so that's what happens when you mix complementary colors together, by the way, just for anybody who didn't know. And so as you can see, just keep working those shadows in. And again, because the way this technique is supposed to work, it's the underside of areas. And so you're imagining, now the way I'm working the shadows are that I'm imagining a light source directly above this guy. Now it gets really boring if you take it really quite literally, doing a light source directly above, because some points of the model would remain completely within shadow, and so would remain quite dark, and you really wouldn't do anything with them, like especially like the shin plates of this guy and that armor underneath his elbow there. And so it really does kind of like if you did it with an airbrush, it's right on top, and then and you got all the color and all the light tones on top, but it looks really kind of boring. And so with this particular type of zenithal highlighting, we're illuminating the highest points of the model. And so that's how we're going to work these highlights with this guy. If you wanted to do it more like how you would see, like you would get with like an airbrush or like a true zenithal kind of highlight, you couldn't do that with brush, of course, but again, you just got to be mindful of where you're applying your paint, your shadows, your highlights. But I find it doesn't suit the tabletop format, as models tend to look really kind of dull and unfinished, actually, unless you get into the details and such. And so that's why we're gonna shade with the complementary color here, and just to keep it kind of visually interesting. And as you can see, as we work our way around the model, the tones become darker, and then once it dries, where we've mixed the rust brown and the blue together, they do become quite dark once it dries, and it leaves you that kind of bright orange in the crevice in it. It's really kind of fun, almost like he's glowing in between the plates and such. And so it's just a different way of achieving the similar effect. And so you can see here in the back of this thigh plate, as we create this shadow in here, as we blend the colors, you can see it starts to turn more of a gray, and the color becomes a lot deeper. You can see there, it's quite orange looking, but we're just gonna blend that backwards again. And again, the more you move the paint around, the smoother your color transitions will be. And so we're getting nice and dark in there. And for the forearm, we just lay some color down, get some shadow happening. You can see here, I use pretty much the same brush to get all these kind of areas done. It's just a regular kind of base coat brush. No fancy fine details yet. And so yeah, that's the beginning part of zenithal highlighting. Again, we're concentrating mostly on shadow, because shadow is 50% of the overall effect. And we'll see you in part 2.